All right, here we go. So, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to Liminality, Security, and Citizenship Along Border Zones, brought to you by Mondo Internazionale GEO. Mondo Internazionale is an international, intercultural, intergenerational, and interdisciplinary nonprofit organization, shortly to become an association of social promotion, working in the field of cultural diplomacy. We have more than 250 associates, four main headquarters in Italy, Nigeria, the Ivory Coast, and Cameroon, with associates from around the world. Mondo Internazionale consists of four main divisions: Hub, Academy, Post, and GEO, standing for Geostrategic Earth Observations, and two main committees, a scientific committee and a development committee, which support both the youth associates and the mission of the association. We also collaborate with several entities such as the World Food Forum, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and the Italian Alliance for Sustainable Development. We are a totally volunteer-run remote association conducting education and training through a practical learning by doing approach. My name is Caitlin Rabe. I'm the research director of GEO, the branch of Mondo Internazionale, which conducts geostrategic analyses and with a particular focus on areas of potential and current crises throughout the world. And I have to be very honest that I'm particularly excited about the discussion that's about to take place, as we're combining two different areas of expertise, or two experts from different sectors. And I'd like to introduce our panelists. So I'll start with Dr. Stefano Felice Beccari, who has been working for several years at the European Parliament as a policy advisor. He has served in several parliamentary committees, such as Security and Defense, Foreign Affairs, International Trade, and Industry, Research, and Energy. After graduating with honors in law from the University of Trieste, he pursued a master's degree at the University of Perugia in International Security Advanced Studies and a PhD in geostrategy funded by Italian Defense, with a thesis on weapons of mass destruction. A former trainee at the Italian Senate, he was then a researcher at the Italian Military Center for Strategic Studies, also carrying out research periods abroad, such as at the National Defense College of the Philippines. He has lectured at universities, research centers, military and police units in Italy and abroad. A youth activist since 2000. Since 2008, he has also been a member of the Italian National Youth Council and a board member in the years 2012 to 2015. He was then elected board member of the European Youth Forum in Brussels. On the other hand, Dr. Lindsay Kingston is an associate professor of international human rights at Webster University in St. Louis, Missouri. She earned her PhD at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs in Syracuse, New York, and currently directs the Institute for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies, which includes overseeing the undergraduate program in international human rights. Dr. Kingston is also a Fulbright Scholar at the University of Milan, who edited Human Rights in Higher Education, Institutional, Classroom, and Community Approaches to Teaching Social Justice. She's also the author of Statelessness, Governance, and the Problem of Citizenship, and she has authored the monograph of Fully Human, Personhood, Citizenship, and Rights, which won the International Studies Association's 2020 Human Rights Best Book Award. And now that I've introduced our panelists and I've shown the different areas of expertise that we're going to confront today, let's get into our event. So essentially, to introduce the topic, the liminality of border zones create gray zones where international protection mechanisms often fail to protect fundamental rights. So we see these spaces, for example, in the Mediterranean, along the U.S. Mexico border, and along the border between North and South Korea, in Europe and elsewhere. These spaces are highly securitized, but also intentionally made more dangerous to thwart movement. So the vulnerability often goes hand in hand with irregular and/or weak nationality status. So people who are stateless or who hold nationality from a politically weak state, for instance, lack the opportunities for movement and rights protection that people with powerful passports enjoy. The international system counts on state governments to be the duty bearers of human rights, but such an approach builds fundamental weaknesses into border security and the global human rights regime. So I'm going to start by directing my first question to Dr. Kingston, and then I'll ask Dr. Beccari to reflect on the question as well. So first of all, how would you define liminality, the word itself, and how does this concept relate to border zones?
Sure. Well, liminality, it's really a transitory in-between space, and that's created by the border zone. So it's a place of ambiguity and indeterminacy, and it's also where social structures and relationships are managed and determined. So when we're talking about the border, that relates to things like citizenship status and even a state's respect for certain norms, like the right to asylum. So the border, it's a physical space that we see with checkpoints and guards and things like that, but it's also a political concept whose function can move geographically. That function of the border doesn't have to remain on that line in the sand, so to speak. It can go inward or outward depending on policies and practices. So the border, I mean, this means all sorts of things when we're thinking about how this plays out in real life. And first of all, I think for anyone who has crossed an international border, you know what I'm talking about when I say that there's a tension there. Even if you have all of your papers in order, that moment when you're clutching your passport or your papers and you're waiting to see if they let you in or not, there's a tension because there's a political power at play. There's a determinacy where they're deciding whether you get to move onward. They're deciding whether you're going to be interrogated or searched, or even deciding whether you're going to be detained for a while. And it makes our palms sweat because of that liminal zone that we find ourselves in. And of course, we all experience that differently. You know, if you have a powerful passport, it might be a moment of nervousness, but you aren't actually worrying for your safety or for your family. Whereas for some people, this is a make or break moment. And we're really seeing this liminality play out in a much broader way in places like the U.S. and also in Europe. Here in the United States, for example, we're seeing even more and more migration detention. So we like to think about that being the U.S Mexico border, as terrible as that situation is, but it's actually the whole country now. So I grew up in Michigan, which if you're familiar with American geography, Michigan is on the U.S Canada border. It's at the very northern edge, unless you count Alaska, of course. But we have migration centers now, detention centers, where people are being brought literally across the United States to be put in detention from the U.S Mexico border, now in Michigan, and in places all around the country. So that those bordering practices are playing out, you know, hundreds of thousands of miles away from the border. There was just an article published in the New York Times recently about how we're seeing an uptick in these really dangerous car chases, where people who are suspected of being undocumented migrants are being chased by the police and getting in car crashes where people are harmed or killed. And we're seeing that all over the country. So these pursuits, these bordering practices and enforcements are not just happening at the border. And I would say that's an expanding liminality that's affecting people, not just at the border crossing, but in their everyday lived experiences.
All right, thank you very much. Dr. Beccari, would you like to reflect on the question?
Yes, thank you very much. And it's very kind of you for having invited me here. I would like to thank you all and all the participants for being here with us, talking about such important issues. Well, you know, after an explanation of a university professor as an ancient student and then PhD student, I can't reply actually, but I will try to just reply not about the explanation of the professor, but just about more a kind of some small example that is coming from my personal background, the background of my studies, especially in I issued last year a book, by the way, also once presented by Mondo Internazionale, a book about Korea and especially North Korea and the area, the context, geopolitical context where Korea, North Korea, South Korea is, where the Korean Peninsula is, let's say like this. And we can say that geopolitical liminality is, I would say, is quite central to understand the current geopolitical landscape of Korea, or I would say the two Koreas. this is not a personal reflection, but a quote that I found in some academic papers that I was studying. Why? Because I mean, briefly, I don't want to open a whole discussion about the issues in the peninsula. We don't have enough time. I would like maybe to provide some more kind of glimpse about how the let's say Korea. When we talk about Korea and we talk about borders in Korea, we switch from a geography and the static border that we see on the map, and that we probably all know, the famous 38 parallel or demilitarized zone that cuts the country in two. Let's say it's a silent border. I would say we see it in the map. We can open every map, geographical map, and it looks very neat, very smooth, I would say. But this maybe looks, nice and clean from, let's say, the perspective, maybe a Western perspective, where I mean, we grew up with borders, especially in Europe. We know how borders are many times preset, and in many cases they are very peacefully enforced. I mean, I know France and Spain, for instance, the Pyrenees, or many areas of that maybe did not suffer too much stress during the First or the Second World War. But if you think that the United Korea exists from 1392 till 1910, so I mean, using a kind of time frame that is very different from the classic studies that we have in the university, medieval time, modern history, contemporary history, etc., etc. We can see that the current division of the two countries is just, let's say, is an outcome of power geopolitical relations that or dynamic relations among different actors. These actors could be the Japanese, who invaded Korea in 1910, then I mean subjugating the whole Korea. Then I mean, after the Second World War, the country was cut in two by the spheres of let's say, of influence of the Soviets from the north, the United States from the south, and then this has let's say, has totally reshaped the history of many centuries of an area that was not used to have a horizontal border separating a north from the south, a North Korea from the South Korea. It's something that, I mean, has been explained by a professor as an odyssey of the 20th century. I mean, it's just to say that this border that maybe from an outside point of view can seem also a matter of stabilization, because the strength is the border is very much enforced by there's a demilitarized zone, but it's a funny acronym because it's plenty of mines, and it's one of the highly controlled borders in the world. I mean, this has totally reshaped the history and the geography, and then in the end of the day, the life of people of the Korean Peninsula, in a way that will probably not come back for a long time. I would say just a small reflection about this topic that obviously is very broad. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm actually going to thank you very much, and I'm actually going to stay with Dr. Beccari for the next question, because I think it goes perfectly into the next question that I have for both panelists. In what specific ways has securitization influenced levels of security and or danger along borders? Dr. Beccari, do you have something to say?
Yes, well, when I was talking about this seminar, I was trying to maybe I was thinking initially to focus my attention only on Korea, China, South Korea, North Korea. But well, I would like to switch from another side, maybe because I'm a European and I live in the European dimension every day, also in the European institutions. So I would like to switch the focus from Far East Asia to something that is, let's say, is closer from an European point of view, obviously, but also catch up what the professor was saying before, catching up with what she was saying before. Securitization, I mean, when I was preparing for this webinar, I opened Google and I wrote securitization and plus Europe in Google. And I mean, there were thousands of links related to migration, a topic that it was already highlighted a few minutes ago. Migration, migrants, etc., etc., etc. Well, maybe from an external point of view, we can think that the current challenge in Europe related with borders is related with migration and then therefore security, etc., etc. But I would like to offer maybe a wider reflection on this issue, dividing the issues, let's say, in basically three spheres. I will try to be quick, but just three different areas that sometimes they overlap each other. Obviously, working for a European institution, I have to say that all my point of view are strictly personal. They don't imply any responsibility for any of the European institutions, but just my personal reflections. Well, I would say that if today, from a foreign observer outside the EU, will try to analyze the challenges and the problem with securitization in Europe, they would say that the challenges lies on three different, let's say, levels of analysis. The first, there are internal security issues. Internal security issues, obviously, the main is migration. I'm Italian. I'm coming, by the way, from a border zone of Italy. I perfectly know what it means, the arrival of migrants in cities. We see it from the boats. Sicily, Malta has the same issues. Spain, obviously, Greece, not to mention Greece, Lesbos, the island. We saw what has happened, what is happening there, and etc., etc. So maybe this usually catalyzes the attention of also of media due to the tragedy and the magnitude of this kind of events. But this is not the only way, I mean, in which securitization is influencing the level of security or the perception of security. We saw that in the last years we had a lot of terrorist attacks in Europe. Many times the trucks or vans or cars were striking in the heart of, I don't know, Strasbourg, Paris, Nice, Berlin, or many other, not to mention the bombing of London, bombs in trains in Atocha station in Spain. I mean, the managing of internal terrorism has seriously increased and altered and probably endangered the perception of security by European citizens. Also in towns or cities or areas where, I mean, this kind of events have been quite far, I would say, from the ordinary perception of insecurity of citizens. There are many other issues that the European Union is facing. For instance, the threat of disinformation or fake news or destabilization that sometimes are carried by more or less state-sponsored actors, and they maybe with their influence, they can influence the opinion of the public opinions in Europe, maybe, and they can influence them. Also, we have on the internal side, I would say also the problem of managing how cyber threats are affecting ordinary life of citizens. We are talking from the most, let's say, criminal activities, from online scams or very, I would say, negative episodes that we saw increasing a lot in Europe during the pandemic. So we're talking about revenge porn, cyberbullying, etc., until higher level threats, I would say, like cyber espionage or acts of cyber war. Again, this, I would say, is also an internal challenge, but maybe we are already moving in the second sphere, let's say the cyber dimension. And then I would say, or a dimension that, I mean, is relevant for our concrete life, but sometimes is more, let's say, in the shades of the between the real world and the cyber one. Finally, a very quick talk about the external dimension along our borders and the perception of the level of insecurity around the borders of Europe. Because if you would have had this talk in 2011 or maybe 2014, maybe we would not have had a revolution in Syria or still an open conflict in Syria, Iraq, or whatever you want to call it, ISIS. Relations with Russia were, I would say, stable before the invasion of Crimea. Not to mention what has happened in Donbass and in Ukraine, what is still happening in these days, you perfectly see it. There is the rise of interest for the Arctic by many competitors, including Russia, China, and many others who live geographically far from Europe, but very present in our geopolitical agendas. North Africa, with what has happened in Libya, destabilization in Egypt, Tunisia was considered a leading democracy of Africa, and you see that they had some problem with their constitution and their division of powers. Again, now, not to mention the relations with Turkey that are quite complicated, etc., etc. So Europe is surrounded by not only is facing internal threats, the threats in the and insecurity in the growing and expanding technological sphere, cyberspace, etc., etc. But also, I would say, unfortunately, our borders are more shaky and unstable than before. This, I think, that the sum of these elements is making us, we as Europeans, reflecting on how to approach in a more proactive way our security. But I would say this is a very interesting topic that would lead us a bit far. We don't have time anymore. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And Dr. Kingston?
All those security threats now have me very stressed out. I will say, when I'm thinking about the securitization of the border, I think about dangers from a human rights perspective that come up in a few different ways. One is more of the long-term lived everyday consequence of the securitization. For example, in the U.S., we have a lot of families that are facing separation. You might have family members where some people are undocumented, some people are American citizens, and we have a lot of really heartbreaking sociological and anthropological research about kids who basically hold their breath every day when they're coming home from school because they don't know if their parents are going to be there. They don't know if their parents would have been picked up and detained or deported while they were away. And so there's a lot of literature about the psychological impacts and the trauma that is really affecting not just an undocumented migrant, but their entire family structure, their social structure. Even though in international human rights law, we know that the family is protected as a fundamental unit of society, that doesn't necessarily play out in practice when it comes to immigration enforcement. But I also think it's important to think about the ways that we've sort of upped the ante, so to speak, about the dangers of crossing the border. There are a lot of folks that say, if we just make it more dangerous to cross the border, if we make it riskier, people will stop coming. We see that with things like prevention through deterrence, where on the U.S. Mexico border, we count on the desert to be so impassable that people won't be able to do it. And we've actually had the government try to criminalize things like leaving water out for migrants, because we want to make it, they want to make it harder to cross. And the Mediterranean, there have been talks about criminalizing saving people who are drowning at sea or boats that are sinking. And I think a lot of data shows us that that doesn't work, because if people are desperate enough, they will come anyway, even if the threat is death, even if the threat is having their children taken away from them. If it's that bad at home, they're going to come anyway. You'll hear people say, the only reason you would put your child in a boat is if the sea is safer than the land. And so I think that's happening. I had a study come out with Livia Ortenzi, who's at the University of Bologna, in the journal International Migration fairly recently. And we had interview data with about 810 migrants living in Lombardia. And they talked to them. The data showed about the threats and the vulnerabilities that they face on the journey to Italy. And what we see is that it is getting more dangerous because of the securitization, in terms of getting beaten, raped, robbed, all of these different things. And we see that the things that used to keep you a little bit safer, like having family networks in Italy, or more money, or more education, or whatever that may be, that's not helping you as much anymore, because it has gotten so dangerous that it's going to be terrible for everybody. But people still come. And in fact, they just strategize differently. They're not being deterred. They're just having to turn more and more to human traffickers and smugglers and corrupt government officials. So it's costing more in terms of money, but also in terms of safety. And, it's still happening. You're not going to stop migration. You're just going to increase human rights violations.
Okay, thank you for your reflections. And I'm going to stay with Dr. Kingston for the next question, because yet again, we're going straight into the next question here. So Dr. Kingston, you are an expert on citizenship. So how does citizenship status tie into the issue of border liminality and security? You touched it at the beginning, but let's go in depth.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's citizenship status in the sense of you are or are not a citizen, but also there are different sorts of passports, right? Some are more powerful than others. Some people are dual nationals. The list goes on. And, you know, I love Dr. Bakari's comment about how when we look at a map, it looks like boundaries are just so neat and clean and simple. And they're not, of course, but it's the same with citizenship. There's no, that binary between citizen or non-citizen is not neat and clean. It's very complicated. I spend a lot of time working with stateless populations. So these are people who do not have legal nationality to any country in the world. And this is a global problem. It happens everywhere, including here in the United States. And a lot of Americans kind of are surprised by that. They don't realize that. But being stateless really just takes all of this conversation that we're having to the next level. So for example, I've done some research on people who were detained in Egypt right before the Arab Spring. They were detained for being undocumented migrants and for entering Egypt illegally, not having visas. So they were put in prison and they had, you know, whatever the prison sentence was, say 2 years. At the end of the 2 years, they were supposed to be released and deported back to their home country, but a stateless person legally doesn't have a home country. So there's nowhere to deport them to. And so you had people who were in prison for 6, 7, 8 years and counting, not because, you know, that was their sentence, but because the state did not know what to do with them. And so they were looking at just indefinite detention. Here in the United States, we have recently had a number of stateless people kind of come out, so to speak. They have called attention to themselves. They've organized into a group called United Stateless. And for years, these people didn't want to be on the radar. They didn't want to tell anyone they were stateless because they were afraid of being detained or deported to a country they didn't know. But during the Trump administration, they felt that the crackdowns on undocumented migrants was so severe that they felt that they had to speak up because bad things were going to happen either way. And I think it's really telling that most governments have no idea what to do with stateless people or even how to recognize stateless people. It was just last month that President Biden, under pressure from stateless advocates like the people at United Stateless, he announced that the United States is going to create a statelessness determination procedure. So a formal procedure for deciding who is stateless. And so I mean, that's great, but it's 2022 and we don't have a process to determine if you're stateless when you're trying to enter the country or stay in the country. And that is mind-boggling to me. We were talking about statelessness at the end of the world wars, and here we are still not knowing how to identify stateless people. So this is really, I think, an issue that is finally getting some attention, but is really, really troubling.
Okay, thank you. And Dr. Bakari, would you like to add anything?
Yes, well, when I was reflecting about the issue of citizenship and I would say and border security. I was considering in this publication that I did, in the research that I did, I researched extensively about the defectors. The defectors are these North Koreans who escaped from North Korea trying to look for a better life. Well, so first, and usually mainly they escape to China, and then they try to go to South Korea. Sometimes they go also somewhere else, but generally speaking, they try to go to China or to South Korea. And again, as the speaker before said, I mean, prevention through deterrence, yeah, works, but until a certain level, because in the end of the day, even if North Korea is a regime known for being quite strict, it's an euphemism, I would say, against the escape from the motherland, I would say that this hasn't stopped the flux of defectors that are leaving the country. In some moments there have been more, in some moments there have been less. Also, sometimes the famine of the 90s has influenced the amount of people who escaped North Korea. But in any case, there are several reasons that sometimes can, psychologically speaking, they can block a person, or in some other cases can trigger the reason to escape. In many cases, what is very funny, I would say, tragically funny, from when you speak with these defectors, I mean, knowing the condition in North Korea, as probably a Western person, we think that it's automatic to try to escape. I mean, which country is worse? But when you speak with defectors, say, no, I mean, for us, it's not like this, because we grow up to be, I'm using the quoting of Mr. Myers, an important author of a book, we are the cleanest race. So, I mean, the best country where to live in. So why should I live paradise on earth if I'm already living in the best country? Because the propaganda of the regime depicts all the countries around, like United States as an invader, I don't know, the Japanese as enemies, I mean, South Koreans as super poor, etc., etc. So psychologically, it's very complicated to think to go away from a place that you believe to be the best place to live in, just because you don't know any alternative. Secondly, there is an issue that is a psychological issue, and the silence and the struggle, internal struggle you have to escape. Because I mean, if you try maybe to speak with someone, you know, if he's an informer of the police, or maybe a policeman or a member of the military who can report you to the police, and this will be the perfect one-way ticket for long detention in a gulag or something like this. Third, there is the logistical implications of trying to escape from North Korea, because I mean, like in the Soviet Union, I mean, you need internal passport to move from one part of the other to the country, and the borders are highly controlled. So again, if you match all these kind of steps, and then you really want to escape, and you manage to escape, then maybe you think that, I mean, leaving North Korea behind, when you go to China, or you manage to go to South Korea, where you have food, you have electricity, you can pay with credit cards, you can have a mobile phone, and heat at home, and you can have 3 meals per day. Maybe, I mean, then it's paradise. And actually not. Again, speaking with defectors, I also had the chance to speak with them in South Korea when I was there. We don't understand the psychological dimension in which they have to live. They have to live in a country. I mean, in China, many North Korean defectors, their citizenship are not recognized. Many times they are just bring back to North Korea. That means a very murky and gray area in which this kind of poor people have to live. I mean, doing kind of unpaid jobs, or low-paid jobs, or paid off the book. And for women, there is a terrible chapter related to rapes, prostitutions, and forced marriage with, you know, sometimes Chinese people. But on the other side, I mean, in South Korea, where maybe the situation is more positive. In the end of the day, during the Cold War, it was cool to have important defectors. But today, I mean, they have so many that, I mean, the Cold War is over. So they are resettled, and then they can live their own life. North Koreans, in the South, can live their own life. But how can you live life in a country that speaks a language that's different from yours? It's a highly competitive society where, you know, cost of life is very expensive. As a North Korean, many times you even don't know how to use basic technologies that for us are automatic. So many times there are the dark side of this effect is even in South Korea, there are a lot of suicide, people who feel the feeling of alienation, or many times the North Korean defectors try to stay among them. And in many cases, and this is the most surprising thing with which I want to conclude this reflection, many times they feel North Koreans, even if all this thing they went through, and now they can understand they can eat better in South Korea, let's say, theoretically speaking, live a more comfortable life. But they say, no, we feel North Koreans, we don't feel South Koreans. So we feel kind of Koreans, but not fully South Koreans. And I think this is, I would say, is really fascinating, and makes us understand that, I mean, the dimension of feeling his own citizenship, even in a country, even if in a country that looks, let's say, better than us, than ours, or our first country, is really complicated, in my opinion.
All right, thank you. And I just saw that we also started receiving questions from Facebook. So if you're in our audience, we can start welcoming your questions. Before we get into questions from the public, I think the question of identity that Dr. Beccari just mentioned. Dr. Kingston, would you have anything to add on that before we get into our questions from our public?
Yeah, I mean, I think identity is really complicated, and it doesn't necessarily depend on your legal status. And so that, I think, is tricky, because we've had this idea pushed on us for a long time that citizenship is supposed to go hand in hand with this very emotional, patriotic sense of duty and identity. And the world increasingly isn't working like that. I mean, I myself am a dual national. I'm Italian American. I have 2 passports. And so I have a little bit of a hybrid identity going there. So your papers don't always reflect what that identity is. I will note here at the U.S. Mexico border, on both sides of the border, we have something called colonias, which are basically these little unincorporated makeshift communities that are made up of people living there who don't want to be seen by the government, of all sorts of different legal statuses. So some Mexican citizens, some Americans, some, all over the place. People that want to be together, and maybe that isn't possible being on the radar of the government. So a lot of them are living without electricity or water or access to hospitals, because citizenship status has been the deciding factor on how they're going to live and how they're going to organize their families. What's their identity there, right? I think so much of our identity is based on factors beyond legal status, and there's not always space for that in a lot of national conversations.
All right, thank you very much. And I think I can start with the questions from the audience. So we got a question from Facebook that I think I'm going to ask Dr. Beccari to answer this first one, or to reflect on this. So the question is, do you think it would be possible to create a common policy at EU or UN level to better protect stateless people, or do we have better chances to resolve the issue if each country approaches the problem unilaterally? So I'll go to Dr. Beccari, and then I'll come to Dr. Kingston for her answer.
Oh, wow, it's a very challenging question, I would say. I would say it would be it's a lovely ambition, but I think it's going to be quite unlikely. I would say within the European Union, we have a system, let's say, called European citizenship. I also took some notes about it, but again, it's a long discussion. But I would say that even in the European Union, or more or less, through very slow pace steps, we managed to grant also in our treaties some rights, right to petition, free movements of persons, of goods, etc., protection of. Well, this kind of let's say enshrined rights for us are still suffering. For instance, everyone has seen that during the pandemic crisis, let's say the internal borders of Europe has been let's say reinstated again, or the procedure, the standards used in one state to, I don't know, related with the Corona pass or Green pass, or how you want to call it, or test, does work in a country but doesn't work in another one. I would say enlarging the complication of managing the complication especially for people who are professionally moving or transborder activities. So I would say maybe in some future moments when there will be some positive attitudes about maybe some of these transnational issues, maybe we can reflect more about these issues. But in the current moment, where we see a strong and very present comeback of the national states and their borders, I think, in my opinion, is slightly difficult. Again, my personal position, not as a EU civil servant.
Yeah, I can definitely agree. Sorry.
Normally, but reality goes in a slightly different direction. Let's say that.
Yeah, thank you. I can definitely agree with the fact that it's a difficult question to answer. I'm particularly interested in the subjects of human development, and the unilateral versus supra international organization approach has always been a question that's been fought over for a long time. Dr. Kingston, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, well, so I would first of all say, if you're interested in learning more about the issue of statelessness in the European context, there's a couple of organizations I'd recommend. One, the European Network on Statelessness, or ENS, and also the Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion, I hope I'm getting that name right, which is split between London and Tilburg in the Netherlands. And so there's a lot of really great research being done. But I do want to point out the fact that stateless people are usually not moving. We tend to think about statelessness as, oh, these are refugees, these are migrants, but the majority of stateless people are not on the move. They're trying to enjoy their fundamental rights in a place maybe where they were born or their family has been for a very long time. So it depends, right? But in Europe, there are stateless people who should legally be entitled to EU citizenship, who have maybe been there for generations and who are denied those rights. And so I think, again, paying attention to things like stateless determination and these different things is really important. Most European countries are party to the 1954 and 1961 statelessness conventions. So they do have obligations under binding international law. And for a long time, that has been so wrapped up in debates about immigration that we failed to identify the problems that are not new to these countries, but have been kind of percolating and marinating there at home.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. I was very excited about the whole multidisciplinary nature of this event, and I think the last two responses have really shown that. All right. I don't see any more questions from Facebook or from our audience. So I think at this point, I would just ask both of our panelists to make any closing comments that they might have. Dr. Beccari, would you like to begin?
But well, building up on what you were saying, we are I think we are in desperate need of increasing transatlantic links. So, especially in the current situation in geopolitical shaky situation we are facing. So, anyway, it's cool to share some views with American with an American touch, let's say, like this. U.S. touch. Sorry, U.S. touch. Anyway, no, I think, thank you very much. I think it's very interesting. These kind of topics are fascinating and are even more fascinating in the European Union, where the more and more we are seeing double, triple citizenships, especially after the issue of Brexit. We have seen a rush of people running for catching the citizenship of husband or wife just in order to have an EU passport, any EU passport. Even the smaller countries we seldom think on the map. So yeah, I think this kind of issues are fascinating, and yeah, borders, citizenship, and the implication of them, they just go beyond just geography and what we see on the maps. They are more dynamic than static. And even in a country, even in a continent like European Union, where slowly we are trying to move towards a European citizenship or a European approach to citizenship. So definitely fascinating topic. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you. And Dr. Kingston?
Yeah, I agree. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to get to know you all better in your work. I agree with the fact that identity and status is constantly changing. And I think even the COVID pandemic, I think, is pointing out a lot of these tensions that maybe we sort of knew were there, but now they're so direct and they're so in our face. Things like documentation and what responsibilities we have as citizens to the societies in which we live. I think we're seeing a huge, difference, divide on that with things like, do you have to be vaccinated? Do you have to wear a mask? These sorts of things. One thing that I think is sort of interesting in the US, and I'm seeing more of this in Europe and elsewhere, is this just really dogged individualism. So in the United States, we are not legally required to carry ID on us. I mean, obviously, if you're crossing a border, you need a passport. If you're driving a car, you need a driver's license. But other than that, no. And I remember living briefly in the Netherlands, and I got in trouble because I didn't have my ID on me when I was on the train. And I was just flabbergasted. I'm like, what do you mean I'm in trouble? Why would I need an ID? As an American, I'm just horrified by this because, freedom in America, we don't have to do that. And it's just so second nature in other places. But again, we have different levels of status even among citizens. So you don't have to have an ID in the United States, but most people of color would tell you they never leave home without an ID, because if they get stopped by the police or interrogated and they don't have an ID, that's something that makes them suspicious. And in fact, recently we had the case of a young Latino boy/man, he was very young, who was an American citizen, and he was picked up without ID. And the process happened so quickly that he was deported before his family even knew what happened to him. So they sued and they settled and he received compensation. But I mean, this is really outlining how there's hierarchies of human rights protection, even among American citizens in the US. So yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, but I think these conversations about this liminality and the securitization of the borders is really important. So thank you for organizing this.
And thank you both for coming and for reflecting and giving us your different perspectives. As I've said twice now during this event, I was looking forward to seeing two different perspectives on the same questions. And I found it really fascinating that we found some points of contact between the different perspectives, between a security perspective and between a human rights perspective. So I'd like to thank you both for coming, and I'd like to thank our audience for your questions and your comments. And I wish a very lovely weekend to everyone, and I hope to see everyone again soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.